as you know, it's election season, and there's a lot of new guys that are coming into offices potentially for the first time. And, well, let's see if we can pull any lessons from across the pond. And Liz Truss's very, very quick and sudden and abrupt resignation from their part of the world. Joining us on 710 KURV is Calum Paton. He is with Young Voices UK. He's a trainee lawyer. He's been a writer for more than 10 years, and he joins us now. So, Liz Truss coming to power, what was that road like? Let's take us on that journey first off.
Yes, so thanks for having me on. So we have a very different system in the UK where essentially the Prime Minister serves at the pleasure of Parliament. So if they don't have the confidence of their party, the party can get rid of them and put someone else in place. So that's what happened in the summer. We had Boris Johnson, who was ousted by his party for a series of scandals about breaking his own COVID rules, basically. So he was ousted in July. They then held a leadership election internally within the party, which lasted for about 8 weeks. At the end of that, Liz Truss was victorious over Rishi Sunak. She then, despite having never faced a vote amongst the general public, only amongst her party and her party members, embarked on what was considered quite a radical economic program. So we had this sort of radical tax cutting mini budget, which she announced, which was cutting income taxes, was cutting national insurance contributions, was cutting corporation taxes, all things like that, which obviously in principle sound great, except from the fact that none of it had been funded. Any independent oversight that usually happens with these sorts of events was discarded, and it didn't happen. And so it all sort of went ahead completely blind, and the markets ended up panicking as a result of that, which left, just a matter of weeks into her premiership, it left her in basically an untenable position and led to her resignation almost 3 weeks to the day after that mini budget.
Calum Paton is with Young Voices UK. He's a trainee lawyer, and we're discussing Liz Truss and her resignation. And I'm saying Truss and not trust. I'm just trying to point that out because I know if I go too fast, you can kind of tell. But what was it that set her apart as at the top of the food chain to get that spot in the first place?
Yeah, so it's quite interesting in a way because she was never particularly seen as this natural politician in the way that many are. She was not a great communicator. She wasn't particularly highly thought of necessarily in her own party, but she did position herself very well. She managed to scrape through to the final ballot amongst her own MPs, basically by the skin of her teeth. She wasn't particularly liked within her own parliamentary party, but throughout the campaign, she positioned herself as this tax-cutting sort of neoliberal in the sort of Thatcher Reagan mold, which is very popular with the membership of her party, because is similar to the Republican Party over there. The way Reagan is seen, Thatcher is seen in a very similar way here amongst Conservative Party members. So she tried to style herself in many ways as this caricature of Thatcher, which went down very well with the membership. And despite sort of never necessarily being seen as the kind of candidate that could be prime ministerial, got the support of enough of the members of the party, which eventually is what took her to power.
We have a lot of people that are about to come into office for the first time here in the U.S. Lots of people running on populist tickets, very conservative people, very pro-business, very anti-taxes, et cetera. And it's a very similar situation, as you've pointed out. So what lessons can we draw from all of this?
Yeah, so the main thing is that our economy in the UK, a bit like your economy, is in a bit of a sticky situation at the moment. Well, I know that your interest rates, I think is it 4% at the moment? Ours are currently at 3% and have been rising all throughout this year. Inflation over here is now over 11%, and I know yours is ticking up as well. And essentially the main lesson is that as much as you may want to implement this sort of agenda, if the economic conditions aren't right, you might actually make the situation worse. So we've had a situation here where all of these tax cuts were going ahead, but there was no idea of how it was going to be costed. So it was adding a huge amount to our deficit. which sent the markets into a bit of a panic. It sent gilt yields rising, which meant that cost of government borrowing was higher. And all of a sudden, you've got a bit of a fiscal crisis going on. So the lesson really is that you need to be wary of what's happening in the wider economy before you start embarking on these ideological programs. And I think if Liz Truss had been more wary of that and had a, less ideologically driven budget, a bit more considered, and taking her time over implementing the kind of policies that she wanted, she might still be in office now. It was the fact that she went really hard, really fast, without taking any kind of consideration of the wider economy and what was happening, that made sure it all blew up in her face. And so the major lesson is, of course, the GOP have come out with the Commitment to America plan, which has a very similar tax-cutting, deregulatory sort of core to it. It is that be careful, because if the conditions aren't right, you may be doing something with the best of wills and trying to achieve something that is, a noble cause, putting more money into people's pockets, but you actually might make them worse off. Because now we've got incredibly fast rising interest rates. People's mortgages are therefore going up drastically. And the cost of living is now far more expensive than if you just had the situation as it was before. The tax cuts that she was proposing would not come close to filling the gap that's now being created by these rises in interest rates. So I think you very much have to be more cognizant of the economic environment. And that's something that I think has been very clear over here, and a bit of a lesson for some of the rest of the world to take.
Calum Paton is he's a trainee lawyer. He's been a writer for more than 10 years. He's the author of a book called 2020 as It Happened, on the events of the coronavirus pandemic. He's our guest on your 956 Drive Home. And we're talking about the eerie similarities between their political situation right now and economic, as well as ours here in the States. How do you navigate the maelstrom of influence? You got your colleagues that are surrounding you in the office, right? And then you got people that, the constituents that are constantly, pounding at your door, trying to get you to move one way or the other. And it's just a lot of opinion floating around you at any point in time. So in times like this, like you had said, to avoid another situation where, hey, maybe railroading all of these tax cuts without accounting for them might not be the best idea to do all at once. How do you manage it?
Yes, I think what's actually interesting about the Liz Truss situation is she didn't really pay attention to any of it. Throughout the leadership campaign, she was up against Rishi Sunak, who is now the Prime Minister, and he spent that entire leadership campaign basically saying exactly what's going to happen if you embark on all these unfunded tax cuts. And so that didn't prove particularly popular with the membership. They wanted, this ideologically driven economic program. He spent the majority of that campaign saying that it's not going to go well. You're going to have the exact sort of crisis that we then had. And I think what's quite clear is that although there were these voices from her own party in Parliament, from, news commentators and writers outside of politics, that she didn't listen to any of it and ploughed ahead with sort of this economic agenda that she had been sort of formulating for decades. Within her own head. And I think it's quite interesting a point as to where you should take your advice from, because she had these quite close relationships with think tanks in the UK. So these sort of really liberal deregulation, tax cutting type of think tanks, primarily based on sort of the ideologies of Thatcher and Reagan. And
liberal in a classic sense, not an American political sense.
Yeah, true. It's quite different actually, isn't it? The way we talk about liberals here in America. But, in that sort of classical liberal sense that, believing in all these tax cuts, and she spent a lot of the time listening to these think tanks rather than to anyone else. And a lot of the agenda that she implemented came straight out of this. And,
it's like the economy is this big dance floor and you're the DJ, and the people on the dance floor kind of just want, hey, is this how much longer is this song going to last at this pace before we start changing things up a little bit?
So it collapses.
And the economy is just looking for stability, and even if the conservative principles are the way to go, you don't want to completely derail the train before it gets to the station. Hey,
exactly.
Tell us about the book 2020 as it happened.
Basically, a collection of news articles from throughout 2020, because obviously it wasn't just an eventful year from COVID, although the majority of the book focuses on that. It was also a significant year for events like the election that you guys had, a lot of, international tension, particularly with Iran earlier on in the year, where you can really look back at what was a quite ridiculous year, really. That's
Calum Paton with Young Voices, joining us on News Talk 710 KURV.
Thank you.